The moment, everything quietly broke. It didn't happen all at once, or maybe it did, but only on the surface. From the outside, it looked like a single moment, a breakup, a loss, a sudden shift you couldn't control. But deep down, something had been loosening long before that day arrived. You just didn't see it, or maybe you did, but you kept moving anyway. Then one morning, you woke up, and something felt missing. Not just motivation, not just clarity, something deeper. The sense of being someone. The quiet certainty that used to guide your decisions, your reactions, your place in the world. It was gone. And what replaced it wasn't exactly sadness. It was emptiness. A strange, disorienting silence where your identity used to be, like standing in a room that still looks familiar, but somehow no longer belongs to you. Most people panic at this point. They try to fix it quickly, distract themselves, rebuild what was lost, find a new version of who they used to be. But here's the part no one tells you. That version of you that might have been fragile all along, not fake, not useless, but constructed, built carefully over time to function, to adapt, to survive. And when something shakes it hard enough, it doesn't bend. It collapses. So the real question isn't, how do I get back to who I was? The real question is much more uncomfortable. What if who you were was never stable to begin with? That silence you're feeling right now, the emptiness, the confusion, it's not just loss, it's exposure. Something has been stripped away, and for the first time in a long time, you're standing without it. Which means this moment, as painful as it feels, isn't just an ending. It's the first honest moment you've had in years. The dangerous instinct to fix yourself. When your sense of self collapses, your first instinct is to rebuild, quickly. You search for answers, routines, distractions, anything that helps you feel normal again. You tell yourself you just need time, discipline, maybe a new direction, something to restore what was lost. It feels like resilience, but often it's just avoidance, wearing a more acceptable mask. Because rebuilding too fast usually means one thing: you're trying to recreate the same structure that just failed. And that's where the real danger lies. There's a quiet assumption behind this urgency, the belief that your previous identity was something worth returning to, that if you could just restore it, everything would make sense again. But what if that identity was the problem? Not entirely wrong, but incomplete, overextended, built to meet expectations, not truth. There's a story about Carl Jung that reflects this perfectly. At one point in his life, everything that defined him began to fall apart. His professional path, his intellectual foundation, even his sense of inner stability. He didn't rush to fix it. He didn't try to immediately rebuild his reputation or regain control. Instead, he did something most people would never dare to do. He stayed in the collapse. Not passively, but consciously. He paid attention to what was happening inside him, even when it didn't make sense. Even when it felt chaotic, uncomfortable, or deeply unsettling. And over time, something unexpected happened. He didn't become who he used to be. He became someone else entirely. That's the part most people miss. Transformation doesn't come from repairing the old structure. It comes from allowing it to fully break, and then understanding why it needed to. So if you're feeling the urge to rush, to fix, to rebuild, pause. Not everything that collapses is meant to be restored. Some things collapse because they were never meant to carry you this far. The mask you didn't know you were wearing. There's a version of you that the world knows. The capable one, the composed one, the one who seems to have things under control, or at least knows how to appear that way. The version of you that learned over time what works, what gets approval, what avoids rejection, what keeps everything running smoothly. You didn't create this version randomly. You built it carefully, piece by piece, through experience, expectation, and necessity. And at some point, something subtle happened. You stopped using that version and started becoming it. Psychology has a word for this: the persona. It's not a lie. It's not something negative by default. It's a tool, a social interface that helps you function in the world. But the problem begins when the tool becomes your identity. Because then, everything depends on maintaining it. Your confidence, your relationships, your sense of worth. They all become tied to how well you can perform that role. So when life disrupts it, when the job ends, the relationship breaks, the structure collapses, it doesn't feel like you lost something external. It feels like you're disappearing. That's why collapse feels so intense, not because you're breaking, but because the structure you depended on is no longer there to define you, and underneath it, there's often very little. Not because you're empty, but because you've never been given the space to explore what's actually there. The real you wasn't prioritized, it was postponed. So now, when the mask falls away, you're left facing something unfamiliar. Not a clear identity, not a stable sense of self, just possibility, unformed, uncertain, uncomfortable, but also real. And this is where things begin to shift, because for the first time, you're not reacting as the version of yourself you learned to be. You're standing in front of the question you avoided for years. Who are you? When there's no role to play. The signs were there. All along. Collapse rarely begins when everything falls apart. It begins much earlier, quietly, almost invisibly. At first, it's subtle, a slight sense of disconnection, a lack of enthusiasm where there used to be energy, a feeling that something is off even if you can't explain why. You dismiss it. You tell yourself it's temporary, stress, fatigue, just part of life. So you keep going. But the signals don't disappear. They adapt. What starts as discomfort becomes tension, then exhaustion, then a deeper kind of numbness where you're functioning but not really present, and still you push through. Because stopping feels risky. Questioning everything feels even worse. So the gap widens. The gap between the life you're living and the life that actually feels true. At some point, that gap becomes too large to sustain, and that's when collapse happens. Not as a random event, but as a response. Your mind and body reaching a limit they can no longer ignore. This is the part most people misunderstand. They think something went wrong. But what if something finally went right? What if the breakdown wasn't failure and is but honesty? A forced interruption of a life that was drifting too far from something essential. When you look back, you might start to see it. The moments you ignored your instincts, the choices that felt slightly off but were easier to accept than to question, the patterns that kept repeating even when they didn't serve you. None of it was accidental. It was building toward this, not to punish you but to stop you. Because sometimes the only way to change direction is to lose the path completely. Facing what you tried to avoid. When everything falls apart, there's a strong urge to move forward, to stay busy, to regain momentum, to feel like you're progressing again. But real change doesn't begin with movement. It begins with stillness. And that's exactly what makes it so difficult. Because when you stop, you start to notice things. Emotions that don't fit your usual image, reactions that feel disproportionate, thoughts you've been avoiding for years. This is where most people turn away. They label it as overthinking, weakness, something to manage or suppress. But what's surfacing isn't random. It's everything that didn't have space before, frustration that was never expressed, needs that were never acknowledged, parts of yourself that didn't fit the identity you were trying to maintain. And now without that structure in place, they're no longer contained. This is often called the shadow, not because it's dark in a moral sense, but because it's hidden, ignored, denied, or pushed aside for the sake of stability. But hidden doesn't mean gone. It means waiting for a moment like this, when the usual defenses are no longer strong enough to keep it out of awareness. And when it finally appears, it can feel overwhelming. Because it doesn't match who you thought you were. But that doesn't make it wrong, it makes it real. The challenge here isn't to control it or eliminate it, it's to understand it, to recognize that these parts of you have been influencing your life quietly all along, through patterns, reactions, decisions you couldn't fully explain. And now for the first time you have a chance to see them clearly, not as problems to fix, but as pieces to integrate. Because without them, any version of you will always be incomplete. You're not rebuilding, you're becoming. There's a point in this process where things start to stabilize. You feel a bit more grounded, a bit more functional. Life begins to move again. And with that comes a temptation. to rebuild everything as quickly as possible, to prove mostly to yourself that you're okay, that you've recovered. But this is where most people make the same mistake twice. They rebuild on the same foundation, the same beliefs, the same definitions of success, worth, identity, and eventually it leads them back to the same place. Another collapse, another breaking point, because nothing fundamental changed. Real transformation doesn't work like that. It's not about returning to who you were. It's about becoming someone who could not exist before this moment, someone who isn't built on performance, approval, or control, but on something deeper, something internal, something real. This shift is slower, less visible, sometimes even uncomfortable, because it doesn't follow familiar patterns. You may do less, achieve less, appear less certain from the outside, but internally, something is different. You're no longer trying to maintain an image. You're trying to understand yourself, and that changes everything. Because the question guiding your life is no longer, how do I succeed? It becomes, what is true for me? And that question doesn't always lead to easy answers. Sometimes it leads to uncertainty, to difficult decisions, to letting go of things that once defined you. But it also leads to something far more stable, a sense of self that doesn't collapse when circumstances change, because it's not built on them. So no, you're not recovering, you're not going back, you're moving into something that didn't exist before. And the only way to reach it is through everything you've just experienced,